There's a genuine, uncomfortable question worth asking directly, one that requires us to turn our critical attention inward for a moment, rather than outward toward the people we've spent this entire series examining. Has the word narcissist stopped meaning anything specific? And if so, what has that actually cost us? Today, we're going to examine this honestly, because understanding the difference between genuine narcissistic personality patterns and ordinary human difficulty matters enormously, both for protecting the accuracy of everything we've discussed throughout this series and for something considerably more personal, making sure the language we use to understand our own pain doesn't accidentally distort our ability to actually heal from it. Let's start with something worth acknowledging directly, because it explains why this linguistic shift happened in the first place, and understanding its origin matters for evaluating whether it's actually served us well. The widespread adoption of narcissism as a popular framework happened for genuinely understandable reasons. For decades, people experiencing exactly the patterns we've traced throughout this entire series, the gaslighting, the narrative control, the attention-seeking disguised as love, the structural incapacity for genuine accountability, had no accessible language for what they were experiencing. They knew something was deeply wrong, but without a framework, they were left with vague, inadequate descriptions. He's just difficult. We're just incompatible. Maybe I'm too sensitive. The popularization of narcissism as a concept gave millions of people genuine, validating language for experiences that had previously felt impossible to articulate or explain to anyone who hadn't lived through something similar. This matters, and it's worth stating clearly before we examine the problems that have emerged. The popularization of this framework has genuinely helped countless people recognize patterns of harm they might otherwise have continued excusing or internalizing as their own fault. This isn't a conversation about dismissing that genuine value. But here's what's happened alongside this genuine benefit, and it's worth examining honestly. The word has expanded considerably beyond its original clinical and practical usefulness, now frequently applied to behavior that, while genuinely difficult or hurtful, doesn't actually reflect the specific psychological structure we've spent this entire series carefully tracing. Someone who's simply selfish in a specific circumstance gets labeled a narcissist. Someone going through a genuinely difficult period who becomes temporarily self-absorbed gets labeled a narcissist. Someone with entirely different psychological patterns, anxious attachment producing controlling behavior, depression producing emotional unavailability, simple immaturity producing inconsiderate actions, increasingly gets filtered through the same single label, regardless of how different the underlying mechanism actually is. Here's why this matters considerably more than simple semantic precision. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about why understanding the specific psychological mechanism matters so much for actually protecting yourself and healing effectively. The strategies that genuinely work against structural narcissistic incapacity for remorse, detachment, released expectations of accountability, complete release of hope for genuine change, represent exactly the wrong approach for someone whose difficult behavior stems from something entirely different. Anxious attachment that might genuinely respond to secure, consistent reassurance. Situational stress that might genuinely resolve once circumstances change. Immaturity that might genuinely develop through time and life experience in ways narcissistic structure genuinely cannot. This means the overapplication of narcissist doesn't just represent imprecise language. It represents a genuine risk of applying the wrong framework to the wrong situation, potentially foreclosing on relationships and reconciliation that were genuinely possible, while wasting the specific hard-won wisdom this series has traced on situations where it was never actually the accurate diagnosis in the first place. Here's something worth examining directly about why this specific overapplication happened, beyond simple popularity of the concept. Remember what we discussed about the genuine relief of finally having language for confusing, painful experiences. This relief, once discovered, can create a specific psychological pull toward applying the same explanatory framework to every subsequent difficulty because it offers a familiar, already understood structure, rather than requiring the more effortful work of accurately diagnosing each new, different situation on its own terms. It's genuinely easier to reach for a framework you already understand than to do the harder work of determining whether this new situation actually matches it. Let's examine what this over-application actually costs, because understanding the specific consequences matters enormously for how you use everything we've traced throughout this entire series moving forward, rather than simply reaching for the label reflexively whenever someone in your life behaves in a way that hurts or disappoints you. Here's the first cost worth understanding directly. It can prevent genuine repair in relationships that were actually salvageable. Remember something crucial we've distinguished throughout this series: the difference between structural incapacity for accountability and situational failure to provide it. A partner who's genuinely, deeply preoccupied with a health crisis, a job loss, or unprocessed grief might temporarily become self-absorbed, emotionally unavailable, even genuinely hurtful in ways that superficially resemble narcissistic patterns. But this behavior, unlike the structural patterns we've traced extensively throughout this series, typically responds to circumstances changing, to genuine support, to time and space for the underlying crisis to resolve. Applying the full narcissistic framework here, the detachment, the released hope, the assumption that accountability will never genuinely arrive, can foreclose on repair that was actually possible, treating a situational crisis as though it were a permanent, unchangeable structural feature. Here's the second cost, one that connects to something we should examine honestly. It can prevent genuine self-examination. If every difficult interaction gets filtered through "they're a narcissist," this framework can quietly function as a way of avoiding the more uncomfortable possibility that a specific conflict might genuinely involve legitimate concerns on both sides. That healthy relationships sometimes require acknowledging our own contributions to difficulty rather than locating the entire explanation in the other person's diagnosable pathology. This isn't about denying genuine harm when it genuinely occurs. Everything we've traced throughout this series remains accurate and important for situations where structural narcissistic patterns genuinely exist. It's about recognizing that reaching for this specific explanation reflexively for every difficulty can become its own kind of avoidance, one that prevents the genuine, sometimes uncomfortable work of examining whether a conflict actually reflects mutual, resolvable difficulty rather than one-sided structural pathology. Here's the third cost, one worth examining because it touches something important about how language shapes our actual experience of relationships. Constant reflexive application of clinical-sounding language to ordinary human conflict can produce a kind of chronic hypervigilance, where every disappointment, every moment of someone else's imperfection or self-focus gets scanned for evidence of pathology rather than simply understood as the ordinary expected texture of imperfect human relationships. This hypervigilance, ironically, can produce exactly the kind of anxious, exhausting relational experience we've spent this entire series helping people heal from, simply redirected toward pattern matching everyone as a potential threat rather than genuinely, calmly assessing each specific relationship on its own actual merits. Here's what's worth understanding about how to actually distinguish genuine narcissistic structural patterns from ordinary human difficulty, drawing together everything we've traced throughout this entire series into practical, usable criteria. Genuine narcissistic patterns, the kind everything we've discussed throughout this series actually applies to, involve consistency across time and across multiple relationships, not simply difficult behavior during one specific circumstance or conflict. They involve genuine incapacity for accountability that persists even when circumstances change, even when the specific stressor resolves, even when genuine, sustained effort at repair has been offered. They involve the specific mechanisms we've traced in exhaustive detail throughout this series: attention seeking rather than love, narrative control that persists regardless of evidence, the structural absence of the psychological architecture required for genuine remorse. Ordinary human difficulty, by contrast, typically shows some capacity for change when circumstances shift, some genuine, if imperfect, response to feedback over time, some evidence of accountability, even if it arrives clumsily or incompletely. This distinction matters enormously because it determines which set of tools actually applies. Detachment and released hope for change genuinely serve you when you're dealing with structural narcissistic patterns. They may genuinely cost you a repairable relationship if you're actually dealing with situational difficulty, unprocessed grief, anxious attachment, or simple immaturity that was genuinely capable of developing given time, support, and genuine effort. Here's something worth naming directly about why this precision matters so much for your own healing specifically, beyond simply protecting the accuracy of relationships with other people in your life. If you've survived a relationship with genuine narcissistic structural patterns, the framework we've traced throughout this entire series genuinely serves you, genuinely explains what you experienced, genuinely justifies the boundaries and detachment that were actually necessary for your own protection and healing. But if this same framework gets applied reflexively to every subsequent relationship, every new person who disappoints you in some way, every ordinary human conflict that arises in the normal course of building new connections, it risks becoming a kind of permanent guardedness disguised as wisdom, one that prevents genuine intimacy with people who were never actually the pattern you survived in the first place. Because here's what this understanding ultimately needs to lead toward, and it's worth being direct about it rather than leaving you simply more cautious about language without offering something genuinely useful to replace reflexive labeling with, something practical enough to actually change how you evaluate difficult relationships moving forward. The first thing worth understanding clearly is a practical framework for actually determining whether narcissist, in the specific structural sense we've traced throughout this entire series, genuinely applies to a situation you're currently trying to understand. Ask yourself honestly and with real rigor rather than reaching for whichever answer feels more immediately validating. Has this person shown any capacity for change when given genuine feedback, genuine time, and genuine space to respond? Not perfect change, not immediate, complete transformation. Any genuine, even partial movement, sustained across more than a single isolated instance, in response to being told clearly how their behavior affected you. Does the difficult behavior persist consistently across multiple relationships and contexts, the way we've traced throughout this entire series as diagnostic of genuine structural patterns? Or does it seem tied specifically to circumstances that might genuinely resolve? A period of grief, a health crisis, a temporary but genuine external stressor that's compressing someone's capacity for empathy without reflecting a permanent architecture incapable of ever producing it? Is there any evidence, even imperfect, even clumsy or incomplete evidence, of accountability ever having occurred across the history of this relationship? Or has every single instance of confrontation produced exactly the defensive collapse, blame shifting, and narrative reconstruction we've traced extensively throughout this series as the structural signature of genuine narcissistic incapacity? These questions matter because they distinguish between two genuinely different situations, requiring genuinely different responses, and conflating them costs you something real, regardless of which direction the conflation runs. If the honest answers point toward consistency, persistent incapacity, regardless of circumstances, and a complete absence of even imperfect accountability across time, everything we've traced throughout this entire series genuinely applies, and the detachment, the released hope, The specific strategies we've discussed at length remain the accurate, necessary response. Trust this recognition completely if this is genuinely what the evidence shows. If the honest answers point towards situational difficulty, some evidence of capacity for change, some imperfect but genuine movement toward accountability over time, a different framework entirely may serve you better. One involving genuine communication, genuine patience calibrated to actual circumstances, and genuine openness to repair that structural narcissism simply doesn't allow for, but that ordinary human difficulty often genuinely does. Here's the second thing worth understanding, one that addresses something important about how to hold this distinction without either extreme becoming its own trap. This isn't a call to become newly suspicious of your own accurate perceptions, second-guessing every instance where you've correctly identified genuine narcissistic patterns throughout this entire series. And it's worth stating this clearly because the discomfort of this conversation could otherwise produce exactly this kind of unhelpful self-doubt. If you've done the careful, honest work of applying these criteria and the pattern genuinely, consistently matches everything we've traced, the attention seeking rather than love, the structural incapacity for remorse, the narrative control that persists regardless of evidence. Trust that recognition completely without allowing today's conversation to reopen wounds you've already correctly closed. This entire discussion is specifically about protecting the accuracy and power of this framework for situations where it genuinely applies, by refusing to dilute it through reflexive application to every difficult relationship, regardless of its actual underlying mechanism. It's not about retroactively doubting conclusions you reach through genuine, careful observation over real time. Here's the third thing worth understanding, one that addresses a specific practical question many people carry after a conversation like this one. What do you actually do the next time someone in your life behaves in a way that hurts or disappoints you, and you feel the familiar pull to immediately reach for the word narcissist as an explanation? The practical answer involves a specific, deliberate pause, one worth building into your own habits moving forward. Before applying the label, ask what we might call the time and pattern test. Has this specific behavior occurred once, or has it occurred consistently across multiple different contexts over a meaningful span of time? A single instance, however hurtful, is data about one moment, not yet evidence of a permanent structural pattern. Give yourself permission to withhold the label until genuine accumulated evidence actually supports it, rather than applying it reflexively to the first available instance of disappointment or hurt. Here's the fourth thing worth understanding, and it circles back to something we should address honestly before closing this conversation. Why precision in this specific language ultimately serves your own healing considerably better than reflexive over-application ever could. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about the specific hard-won tools that genuinely work against structural narcissistic patterns. The detachment, the released hope for accountability, the calm indifference that removes his access to engagement entirely. These tools are powerful, genuinely transformative, precisely because they're calibrated to a very specific psychological structure. Applying them reflexively to relationships that don't actually match this structure doesn't simply risk foreclosing on genuine repair. It risks training yourself into a permanent relational posture of guardedness and detachment that was never actually necessary for the relationships you're applying it to, potentially costing you genuine intimacy, genuine growth, and genuine connection with people who were never actually the pattern this entire series has been helping you heal from. Here's the fifth and final thing worth understanding, the piece that ultimately matters most as we close this conversation. Language shapes how we experience our own lives, and precision in this specific language matters enormously, both for protecting genuine survivors of structural narcissistic abuse from having their experience diluted by over-application, and for protecting your own capacity for genuine connection from being foreclosed by a framework that, however validating and useful when accurately applied, was never actually designed to explain every instance of ordinary human disappointment or difficulty. The word narcissist carries real, important weight precisely because it describes something specific, structural, and genuinely different from ordinary human imperfection. Protecting that specificity protects everyone who's genuinely needed this language to finally understand and heal from what they survived. Using it more carefully, more precisely, reserving it for the patterns we've spent this entire series carefully, thoroughly examining, doesn't diminish your own experience if you've genuinely lived through structural narcissistic abuse. It simply ensures that when you use this word, it continues carrying the full, accurate weight it deserves, rather than becoming so broadly applied that it eventually stops meaning anything specific at all for you or for anyone else who genuinely, desperately needs this specific language to finally make sense of what they survived. For anyone who genuinely, desperately needs this specific language to finally make sense of what they survived. There's one more dimension worth examining here because it addresses something we've touched on but haven't fully unpacked. What actually happens, psychologically, to the people around us when this word gets applied loosely and repeatedly. Remember, that language doesn't just describe reality. It actively shapes how the people hearing it interpret their own relationships and behavior. When narcissist gets applied casually to a partner who forgot an anniversary, to a friend who talked too much about her own week, to a coworker who took credit for a shared idea once, something happens that's worth naming directly. The word starts functioning less like a diagnosis and more like an insult, a maximally damning label reached for whenever ordinary human disappointment needs a satisfying, dramatic explanation. This matters because it changes what happens the next time you actually encounter someone who fits the genuine structural pattern we've spent this entire series carefully tracing. If you've already applied this label to 3 or 4 people who were simply flawed, busy, self-absorbed for a season, or genuinely capable of growth, the word has lost some of its diagnostic sharpness by the time you actually need it to accurately name something dangerous. This isn't simply an abstract linguistic concern. It has real consequences for how quickly you recognize genuine danger when it actually appears, because a word used up on ordinary disappointment doesn't carry the same weight, doesn't trigger the same appropriate caution when it finally needs to describe something genuinely structural and genuinely threatening to your well-being. Here's something else worth considering directly. The cultural conversation around narcissism has, in some corners, drifted toward treating almost any assertion of someone else's needs, any instance of someone prioritizing themselves in a moment, as evidence of pathology. This drift deserves careful examination because healthy relationships genuinely require both people to have needs, to occasionally prioritize themselves, to sometimes disappoint the other person without that disappointment reflecting any deeper psychological damage at all. If every instance of a partner saying, "I need some time to myself this weekend," or "I'm not able to help with that right now," gets filtered through suspicion of narcissistic withholding, something has gone wrong with the framework, something that ultimately makes healthy, reciprocal relationships considerably harder to build and sustain, precisely because ordinary, healthy boundary setting starts looking indistinguishable from the pathological patterns we've spent this series examining. This is worth sitting with directly because it points towards something important about the difference between reciprocal, healthy relationships and the one-sided, structurally exploitative dynamics we've traced throughout this entire series. In genuine narcissistic relationships, the imbalance is consistent and one-directional. His needs matter, yours consistently don't, and this pattern never meaningfully reverses regardless of circumstances. In healthy relationships, needs and priorities shift back and forth between both people over time. Sometimes he needs more support, sometimes you do, and this fluctuation, rather than indicating pathology, actually indicates health. Learning to distinguish consistent, one-directional imbalance from ordinary healthy fluctuation is perhaps the single most practically useful skill this entire conversation can offer you, because it protects you from applying narcissism-shaped suspicion to relationships that are actually functioning exactly the way healthy relationships are supposed to function. Here's a final practical way to hold all of this together as you move forward from this conversation.